Look, if you've been told that the key to lowering your blood pressure is simply cutting back on salt, I need you to hear me out for the next few minutes. Because that advice, it's incomplete at best, and at worst, it's sending you in the wrong direction entirely, while the real causes of your high blood pressure continue to damage your arteries day after day. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through 4 overlooked causes of high blood pressure that rarely get explained to patients. And the best part? You can start addressing most of them today, often without adding another medication to your routine. So if you've been doing everything right and your numbers still won't budge, stay with me. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. I'm not saying sodium doesn't matter at all. It does, for some people. But here's what the research actually shows, and this is where it gets interesting. When you look at large population studies, I'm talking about data from over 180,000 people across 49 countries, here's what we find. Only about 25 to 30% of people with high blood pressure are what we call salt sensitive. That means roughly 70% of you watching this right now could cut your salt intake in half and see almost no meaningful change in your blood pressure. None. And yet, what's the first thing you're told when your numbers creep up? Watch your salt. Every single time. Now, why does this happen? Well, the salt-blood pressure connection is easy to explain. It's simple. Put less salt in, less water retained, pressure goes down. It makes intuitive sense. But biology is rarely that simple. What doesn't get explained is this. Your blood pressure is controlled by multiple systems working together. Your kidneys, your hormones, your blood vessel walls, your nervous system. And when one of these systems is stressed or deficient in something it needs, your blood pressure goes up, regardless of how much salt you're eating. So today, I want to talk about 4 of these hidden stressors that I look at in my practice. Because once you address them, I've seen blood pressure drop faster than most people expect. Let's start with what I consider one of the most underrated minerals when it comes to blood pressure: magnesium. And I want you to really understand why this matters, not just take my word for it. Your blood vessels have smooth muscle cells in their walls. These cells contract and relax, which is what controls how wide or narrow your blood vessels are at any given moment. When they relax, blood flows easily and your pressure stays normal. When they contract too much or too often, pressure goes up. Now here's the key. Magnesium is what allows those muscle cells to relax. It's literally the off switch for vascular contraction. Without enough magnesium, your blood vessels stay in a semi-contracted state almost all the time. You're essentially walking around with tighter blood vessels than you should have, 24 hours a day, and that shows up on the blood pressure monitor. Now, this isn't just theory. A meta-analysis of 34 randomized controlled trials, that's over 2,000 participants, found that magnesium supplementation reduced systolic blood pressure by an average of 2 mmHg and diastolic by 1.8 mmHg. And here's what's important. The effect was dose-dependent, meaning the more magnesium people took, up to a certain point, the more their blood pressure improved. At doses of around 365 milligrams per day, some studies showed reductions of 4 to 5 mmHg systolic. That's meaningful. That's the difference between staying on a lower dose of medication or needing to increase it. Why it's so common? Now you might be thinking, okay, but am I actually deficient? Here's the uncomfortable truth. An estimated 50% of Americans don't get enough magnesium from their diet. Some estimates go as high as 68%. Why? First, our soil is more depleted than it was 50 years ago, so even healthy foods contain less magnesium than they used to. Second, refined and processed foods, which make up a huge portion of modern diets, have most of their magnesium stripped out. And third, and this is important, certain medications actually deplete your magnesium. Proton pump inhibitors, the ones you take for acid reflux, they reduce magnesium absorption. Diuretics, which are often prescribed for blood pressure, they increase magnesium excretion. So it's entirely possible to be eating reasonably well and still be walking around deficient, and your doctor probably isn't checking your magnesium levels routinely. So, practically speaking, what should you do? First, focus on magnesium-rich foods. Pumpkin seeds, dark chocolate. The real stuff, 70% or higher. Spinach, almonds, black beans, and avocados. These should be regular parts of your diet. Second, consider supplementation. The forms that are best absorbed are magnesium glycinate or magnesium citrate. I'd suggest starting with 200 to 300 milligrams per day, and if tolerated, working up to 400 milligrams. One thing to watch for: magnesium citrate can have a laxative effect in some people. If that's an issue, switch to glycinate. And listen, This is one of those changes where some people notice a difference within a few weeks. Not everyone, but enough that it's worth prioritizing. Now here's one that almost never gets discussed when we talk about blood pressure, and yet it might be the single most important factor for a huge percentage of people. I'm talking about insulin resistance, or what sometimes gets called pre-diabetes. But honestly, that term undersells how much damage this state can do, long before your blood sugar ever gets flagged as abnormal. Let me explain what's actually happening in your body. When you eat, especially carbohydrates, your blood sugar rises. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin, which tells your cells to absorb that sugar and use it for energy. In a healthy system, this works smoothly. Insulin goes up briefly, sugar gets absorbed, insulin comes back down, and everything resets. But when you have insulin resistance, your cells don't respond to insulin as well as they should. So your pancreas has to produce more insulin to get the same effect. This means you're walking around with chronically elevated insulin levels, what we call hyperinsulinemia. And here's where blood pressure comes in. High insulin levels do several things that raise blood pressure. First, insulin causes your kidneys to retain sodium. So even if you're not eating that much salt, your body is holding on to more of it. Second, high insulin stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, which constricts blood vessels and increases heart rate. Third, over time, elevated insulin promotes thickening and stiffening of your artery walls. This is called vascular remodeling, and it makes it harder for your vessels to expand and contract normally. So if you're insulin resistant, and about 88% of American adults have at least some degree of metabolic dysfunction according to recent data, your blood pressure isn't primarily a salt problem, it's a metabolic problem. The numbers here are striking. People with metabolic syndrome, which includes insulin resistance as a core feature, are approximately 50 to 60% more likely to develop hypertension compared to those with normal metabolic health. And here's what's frustrating. Standard blood tests often miss early insulin resistance. Your fasting glucose might still be in the normal range, so you're told everything looks fine. But your fasting insulin could be elevated for years before glucose starts to rise. This is why I often check fasting insulin levels in my patients with stubborn high blood pressure. It catches the problem earlier. So how do you address this? The most effective approach, and I say this directly, is reducing your intake of refined carbohydrates and added sugars. I'm talking about white bread, pasta, pastries, sugary drinks, and processed snacks. You don't necessarily have to go extremely low carb, though some people benefit from that. But prioritizing protein, healthy fats, and fiber-rich vegetables while minimizing the foods that spike your blood sugar, that's the foundation. Regular physical activity is also crucial. When you exercise, your muscles become more sensitive to insulin, which helps bring those levels down. And for some people, especially those with significant insulin resistance, intermittent fasting can accelerate progress. Even a simple 14 to 16-hour overnight fast gives your insulin levels time to drop and stay low for a sustained period. This isn't about perfection. It's about moving the needle. Because when insulin levels normalize, blood pressure often follows, sometimes within weeks. Now, here's something that most people, including many doctors, don't fully appreciate. There's a direct pathway between fructose consumption, uric acid levels, and high blood pressure. And understanding this can be genuinely eye-opening. Let me walk you through it. When you consume fructose, and I'm not talking about the fructose in a few berries, I mean the concentrated amounts in sodas, fruit juices, and foods sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, your liver metabolizes it differently than other sugars. During this process, something interesting happens. Uric acid is produced as a byproduct. Now, you might associate uric acid with gout, those painful joint flare-ups. And yes, that's one consequence. But here's what's less known. Elevated uric acid directly affects your blood vessels. Uric acid reduces nitric oxide in your vascular endothelium. Nitric oxide is the molecule that tells your blood vessels to relax and dilate. Less nitric oxide means more vascular constriction. More constriction means higher blood pressure. This isn't speculative. Studies have shown that for every 1 mg/dL increase in uric acid, the risk of developing hypertension increases by approximately 13%. And here's the kicker. In adolescents with newly diagnosed hypertension, studies using allopurinol, a medication that lowers uric acid, showed blood pressure reductions of up to 6 mmHg systolic. That's substantial. Why this is so relevant today? The average American now consumes somewhere between 50 and 80 grams of fructose per day. Compare that to 100 years ago, when intake was closer to 15 grams daily. Where's it coming from? Soft drinks, sweetened beverages, packaged foods, condiments, even healthy smoothies that contain multiple servings of fruit juice. And most people have no idea their uric acid is elevated until they either get a gout attack or a doctor happens to check it. In my practice, I routinely check uric acid levels in patients with resistant hypertension, meaning their blood pressure isn't responding well to standard treatment. And you know what I find? A significant number have levels above 6 mg/dL, which is associated with increased cardiovascular risk. So, the practical steps here. First, dramatically reduce or eliminate sugary beverages. This includes soda, sweet tea, energy drinks, and yes, fruit juice. Even 100% natural fruit juice is concentrated fructose without the fiber. Second, limit high fructose processed foods. Check labels. High fructose corn syrup is in far more products than you'd expect. Third, ask your doctor to check your uric acid level. This is a simple blood test. If it's elevated above 5.5 or 6 mg/dL, that's a signal to address your fructose intake. In some cases, medication might be appropriate, but dietary changes alone can often bring levels down. And fourth, certain foods actually help lower uric acid. Cherries, coffee in moderate amounts, and vitamin C. Consider incorporating these strategically. Now, here's the irony of the whole cut your salt message. What the research actually shows is that the ratio between sodium and potassium matters more than the absolute amount of either one. Let me explain why this is so important. Sodium and potassium work together to regulate fluid balance and blood vessel tone. They're essentially two sides of the same coin. Your kidneys are constantly adjusting how much of each mineral you excrete. When potassium intake is adequate, your kidneys are better able to excrete excess sodium. When potassium is low, your kidneys hold onto sodium more tightly, which raises blood pressure. Beyond that, potassium has its own direct effect on blood vessel relaxation. It helps counteract the blood pressure-raising effects of sodium at the cellular level. So here's the key insight. You could cut your sodium intake dramatically, but if your potassium intake is still too low, you're missing half the equation. The ratio is what matters. A meta-analysis of 22 studies found that increasing potassium intake lowered blood pressure by an average of 4.5 mmHg systolic and 2.5 mmHg diastolic in people with hypertension. And when researchers looked at the sodium to potassium ratio specifically, they found this. People with a higher ratio, meaning more sodium relative to potassium, had a 24% increased risk of cardiovascular events. The current recommendation for potassium intake is around 4,700 milligrams per day. But surveys show that fewer than 2% of Americans actually meet this target. 2%. So almost everyone reading this could benefit from eating more potassium. Potassium-rich foods include bananas, though they're actually not the highest source, sweet potatoes, white beans, spinach, tomatoes, oranges, and avocados. One sweet potato contains about 540 milligrams. 1 cup of cooked spinach has around 840 milligrams. A cup of white beans has over 1,000 milligrams. My suggestion, rather than obsessively tracking sodium, focus on adding potassium-rich foods to every meal. This shifts the ratio in your favor naturally. One caution. If you have kidney disease, potassium handling can be impaired, and you should talk to your doctor before significantly increasing intake. But for most people, this is an incredibly safe and effective strategy. Here's what I really want you to understand. And this is the piece that brings everything together. These factors don't exist in isolation. They compound. They interact. They make each other worse. Think about it. If you're insulin resistant, you're also more likely to have low magnesium, because insulin affects magnesium retention in the kidneys. If you're consuming a lot of fructose, you're spiking both your uric acid and your insulin levels. If your diet is high in processed foods, you're getting excess sodium, minimal potassium, almost no magnesium, and plenty of hidden fructose. It's a perfect storm. And when these small stresses accumulate, your blood pressure rises not because of one single cause, but because of many small dysfunctions happening simultaneously. This is why someone can be relatively healthy by conventional measures and still have stubbornly high blood pressure that doesn't respond well to medication. And here's the empowering part. Because these factors are interconnected, addressing even 2 or 3 of them can create a cascade of improvement. When you improve your metabolic health, your magnesium retention improves. When you reduce fructose, your uric acid drops and your insulin sensitivity improves. When you eat more whole foods, your potassium goes up while refined carbs and fructose go down. You don't have to be perfect, you just need to be strategic. Now, there's more to this story that I didn't have time to cover today. Things like vitamin D deficiency, which affects blood vessel function in ways that are only recently being understood. Sleep apnea, which can drive blood pressure up by activating your stress response dozens of times per night without you even knowing it. And something called primary aldosteronism, a hormonal condition that's far more common than we used to think, and which makes blood pressure almost impossible to control without specific treatment. I'll get into all of these in future videos. So if you want to make sure you don't miss them, you know what to do. But here's why I want you to take this seriously now. High blood pressure is often called the silent killer for a reason. You can walk around for years with elevated pressure, feeling completely fine, while damage is accumulating in your arteries, your heart, your kidneys, and your brain. And here's the thing that doesn't get said often enough. Some of this damage is reversible if you catch it early. But there's a point where it's not. There's a point where the stiffening, the thickening, the narrowing of your blood vessels becomes permanent. I don't say this to scare you. I say this because I've seen what happens when people dismiss high blood pressure as not that serious or assume they'll deal with it later. Later comes faster than you think. So look at your diet this week. Check your magnesium intake. Cut back on the sugary drinks. Add more potassium-rich foods. Ask your doctor about your uric acid and fasting insulin levels. These aren't radical changes. They're adjustments that, when made consistently, can genuinely transform your cardiovascular health. You have more control here than you've probably been led to believe, and you deserve to know that. I hope this has been helpful. Take care of yourself. Stay healthy.